Howdy everyone, I'm Jeffrey Wallace. I've been working on this presentation for the better part of 4 or 5 months now, and I finally decided to get it off my back. In this presentation, I'm going to review some moral panics that have taken place over the years and try to dissect and explain the research bias behind them and why they kind of happened. Despite the classes that I've taken in the social sciences, it's kind of hard to nail down research bias because it is so vast, and there are many types that can be used for it. Go ahead and switch. As for Webster's dictionary, for the definition, I got that it's a systematic error introduced into sampling or testing by selecting or encouraging one outcome or answer over others. It can include skewing the population sample to get results that are more desired or preferred by the researcher, or simply excluding individuals that you know could skew it in a less favorable light. Today I'm going to be talking about attribution bias, which is when you use somebody's character or their characteristics to define why they did something or why something was done. So let's switch. For moral panics, the term was coined by that man Stanley Cohen in his book Folk Devils and Moral Panics, the creation of the Mods and Rockers. It wasn't until Landis and I found this book that we were actually able to really move along with this study. It brought a lot to light and kind of carried me for a while, getting my footing. Many editions have been released since his initial one. I'm using the 2011 version, where he spends his introduction covering different moral panics that have happened and kind of explaining why they did. A moral panic is when a community or a group of people collectively become afraid of something, a folk devil, and they seek to destroy it or eradicate it from their population to save themselves. They are blown out of proportion, causing genuine fear over something that should not be feared. And while there is a genuine fear that should be there often is a reasonable cause for why they start. It's the things they blame it on that are usually not desirable. Go ahead and switch. For our first example, we're going to be going down to Salem, Massachusetts, one of the most famous examples of this, and one of my favorite periods of history to learn about. I think it's very fascinating. The general story is known. Go ahead and switch. People, mostly impoverished women or foreigners, were claimed to be witches, like Tituba here, who I will expand on. Don't let her presentation fool you. I know that she doesn't look acceptable, or not witch-like, rather. On the right, that's Reverend Samuel Parris. He was the father and uncle of the 2 girls that initially accused all the women. Tituba was a woman who was most likely Caribbean or African, definitely not a Puritan like all the other white people were. And she was more than likely the slave to Samuel Parris. And so she was a very easy scapegoat to latch onto to start this panic. After they accused her, it was likely that she had a confession beaten out of her by Parris as punishment for creating a witch cake to find out who the witch was, which is when you mix dog urine and other not nice things, you feed it to someone, and then you find out if they're a witch or not. It's not great. During her interrogation, she claimed that she had made a covenant with Satan. A man had appeared to her and claimed that he was God. And after a while, after more and more time, she was very eager to please her interrogators, which is a trend that we see as trials and interrogations go on. People are more willing to get things over with and spend less time in there. There is a famous case in Sweden, I believe it's Gudmundur Anderson, where people were kept in prison for over years and years for a crime that they likely had no part in. And the only way they saw out of it was to confess to the crimes. And of course, you confess to the crime, you're going to spend more time in there. And it's a situation where you could not win. Similarly to Salem, if you'd like to go ahead and switch the sides, we see the tribes themselves. And these were very skewed. You'd have the judge, you'd have Reverend Paris, you'd have the children there accusing them of faking seizures to make it more likely that these women are witches. And when you've got this happening, there's really nothing you can do to really defend yourselves in the courtroom. You've already got this Puritan town scared of the devil that is terrified of this woman, that thinks they're a witch, thinks they're seeking to destroy them. And so obviously, you're gonna vote to execute them, get rid of the evil, and then when the fear stays, you're gonna move on to the next person. In my field, I'm going into criminal justice. I view the interrogations and trials as part of a research process. The interrogations are part of gathering it, the trial is the culmination of it. And usually that's the way it is. Here, the trials were just interrogations, and very heavily skewed ones at that, where you didn't stand a chance. And if you tried to speak out against them, like some men would, because the people accused were generally women, you would get, like one man did, pressed to death by heavy rocks, which sucks. Cohen wrote that the continued fuzziness of the evidence for such links is overcompensated by confident appeals to common sense and intuition. When such appeals come from voices of authority or authoritative voices, the moral panic is easier to sustain. And we see that in the trials. You've got the judges of the town and the reverend claiming that these women are witches. And there's nothing that can be done about that, which is unfortunate, and why it went on for over a year and caused the deaths of 25 people. My second example takes place far more recently and requires less historical insight, as you can go and switch. We're going to look at the aftermath of the Columbine shooting and the effect that had on the 2000s. In an article written by Christopher Ferguson and Patrick Markey, who I got the majority of my information on this one from, they mention a shooting committed by a 19-year-old black man, go and switch sides, Nathan Dunlap. He was a former worker at his Chuck E. Cheese that was fired. And in retaliation, after the night ended, he had stayed inside one of the bathrooms and waited after hours and killed 4 people, thinking he'd killed 5. He had only maimed him, and that led to his arrest. In the media, he was completely banned. Nobody tried to find an excuse, no outside sources or external factors. He was just villainous. The media focused on his desire for revenge, his hatred, and his rage. Compare that to the Columbine shooters, who the media was a lot more kinder to, and they tried to find excuses for why these 2 white kids could commit a crime like this. They focused and eventually found their cause, video games. Cohen said, fully fledged moral panics need an extreme or especially dramatic cause to get going. It's not like there wasn't any kind of gun violence in America at the time, because we're pretty infamous for that. But in terms of school shootings, the most notable one, I think, in our history is Columbine. There was one that caused more deaths decades prior, the UT Austin clock tower shooting, but none had hit America quite like this one. This felt like it was in our backyard. It was a suburban area. Anybody could happen to be living there, and it could happen anywhere else in the United States, which Cohen focuses on. The slide towards moral rhetoric depends less on the sheer volume of cases than a cognitive shift from how could it happen in a place like this to it could happen any place. And Columbine marked that shift. Instead of seeing it like it was, 2 kids committing terrorism for sick kicks, the politicians found video games as their excuse. The media focused on Klebold and Harris playing Doom prior to the shooting, and the media latched onto this. They found that this had to be the reason. There couldn't be anything wrong with the kids to cause them to kill that many people, or something inside of them that was wrong. It had to be an external factor, unlike with Dunlap, who more or less shrugged off. And I think race definitely played an element into that, as well as with the Salem and Tituba. You got a foreigner in Salem that you can easily place the blame on. And the white media was very eager to jump on this. It goes even further than that. Several scholars argue that media violence had an impact on society on par with the impact of smoking on lung cancer, which, bold claim, we all know how bad smoking is for your lungs. It's not something that you want to be subjecting yourself to. I come from a childhood of always being around video games. My big brother got me into it when I was just a kid. I got my little brother into it. And I feel pretty confident in saying I've never done anything on this scale. So I find it a little hard to believe that this is what inevitably led to them doing this. There were studies that came out that showed that video games can cause aggression, but none that could cite that this was definitively the cause for why they did this or why any other person did this. If you'd like to go ahead. Throughout the 2000s, we see a new folk devil, video games, and we see heavy pushback. On the left, we have the Grand Theft Auto series, which are notoriously violent, and politicians and lawyers hated this. They did not want any part of it, and they did not want children getting their hands on it. On the right, we have Mass Effect, infamous for another reason. If you'd like to go ahead to the next slide. There were news channels covering it. The headline Sex Box, where people were coming on the show and claiming that the game featured full frontal nudity. Sex Box being played on Xbox, console that it was on. This coverage was very controversial because it was found that one expert claimed Mass Effect would harden children's future sexual and social development, despite later admitting she had not bothered to play or even look at the game. So you've got people that are not knowledgeable on the topic or have any experience whatsoever talking about it and condemning it. While on the right, you have a man that is more experienced in it, has time playing it, understands it, and when he tries to contradict or go against what she's saying, he's consistently rejected and the chance to say what he wants to say. The media isn't allowing him to get his say because it is against what their agenda is pushing, which is a shame. Beliefs about the dangers of video games came first, and then dubious social science capitalized on these fears, which is what we see. The number of published research articles examining video games increased nearly 300% in the wake of Columbine. It wasn't something that people were worried about until something like this happened, and they found an excuse to give these kids an excuse for committing a tragedy. Instead of condemning them in their actions, there was something else that caused them to do this. If you'd like to go into the next slide. Fortunately, I went after Stephen. Unknowingly, a week ago, I was struggling to really wrap this all up, and I came to the future of moral panics and where it could be going. And I landed on where I see it going, robots and them kind of taking over, as people would be afraid of. I wrote that moral panics have taken place for hundreds of years, and they will continue to take place after we die. There are people now that are terrified of robots, be it for the idea that they will eventually take our jobs or overthrow humans. So following him up was a little ego boost and a confidence lifter, knowing that I was kind of on the right trail. I want to wrap it up. With fear comes bias. When people have a reason to be afraid, they will have a reason to insert their bias into their projects. That is the essence of what we have gone over today. This does not only cover the witch trials and video games, however. Look at other moral panics that have taken place over the last 100 years. If you look hard enough, you'll inevitably find more and more bias. Thank you.
I didn't plan that, by the way, Stephen.
Yeah, no, I didn't look at what he was presenting.
That's good.
And so when I came in and saw him on that board and him talking about AI, I was like,
Serendipitous.
yes, sir.
Okay, so how did you avoid bias in your research?
That was hard. That was something that Wallace and I had to talk about and figure out how to best navigate that. Because like I said, I come from a place where video games were consistently around my household. I grew up playing them. My brother is deep into them now. It's all he does. And so it was hard. Initially, my misconceptions about Salem were that they would drown women and they would do all kinds of external things or different things. So it was all about really learning the facts about what happened and learning that I was wrong about my conceptions about them.
I got another one,
Go for it.
if that's okay. So I like how you present the two, the witch trials and Columbine. I wasn't sure where you're going to go with Columbine, and then I saw how you're doing that. That's really great. These are two that are clearly, the bias seems, or at least the way you present it, seems very clearly rooted in some racial features.
Yes.
Right?
And that's what I kind of landed on when I was looking at them, is that there's a lot of racial prejudice going into them that kind of spearheaded them.
In those two, but not all
No,
instances of
absolutely
bias
not.
and moral panic, right? So your example here, obviously, if our attitudes towards AI constitutes a moral panic, it doesn't necessarily seem to be one that's racially motivated.
No, it's
Okay.
just a fear of being replaced, maybe. That's what the one on the left is, them taking our jobs and replacing the workforce, putting people out of job and causing more and more unemployment.
Perfect.
Well, the
So
one on the right is,
military,
yes,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
or an AI takeover of the schools.
So think about that, right? With that kind of thing in context, I want to pose a question on the Salem witch trials, right? With this kind of in the background. You said that moral panic is when you have a fear over something that you should not be afraid of.
It's when you have a fear over something, but you place your fear onto something that is not deserving of it. It's misplaced fear.
Misplaced fear.
Yes, the
Okay.
fear, like with Columbine, is a genuine fear, but they find the wrong thing to place it.
Like the video games.
Yes.
Right, okay. So let's say that, like in the Salem witch trials, let's say that the thing that they're afraid of and where they're placing their fear is true, right? Maybe not for, I forgot the person's name.
Digital.
Yeah, maybe not there. Maybe for all the other, because this wasn't just this one person. This
No.
like stretched out into a lot of. So let's say that there were, and I understand that you may not believe this, others may not believe this, but just go with me here for a minute. Let's say that there's a devil, and that he was influencing these women to do these things and everything, and the fainting wasn't fake, and the seizures weren't fake, and all that stuff was real. Okay?
Right.
Shouldn't they have been afraid?
Absolutely. I mean, if it was real and there genuinely was the devil in Salem, then I think the devil is one of the more acceptable fears. I've got plenty of unrealistic fears. One being getting jumped in a bathroom and kind of being cornered in there.
Sure.
So I can understand being afraid of the devil.
So we take that, and then I said, hold on to this, right? So then we come back to this and we think about this. How do you know, and here's the question, and then I'll shut up, I promise. How do we know, yeah, you're welcome. How do you know that you're in a moral panic? It seems like your examples are like, well, they were in a moral panic and we know that now, shame on them
Right.
for misplacing their fear. Same thing with Columbine, right? They were in a moral panic, now we know that, shame on them for blaming the video games. But how do we know that we're in a moral panic until, because this seems like we don't know here, there's a big question mark on the AI thing. If the images you show turn out to be true, that is frightening.
Right,
And
absolutely.
I should be afraid of that. So how do I know that this is a moral panic or not, this side of it?
It's hard to tell, especially with Salem. You believe that you have the devil in your town, and that's something to be very afraid of. So you don't know you're in a moral panic because you genuinely believe in that cause. Same with the aftermath of Columbine. People genuinely believe that video games were steering their children towards violence, sexual deviance, all of the sort. So with this, it's hard to tell because people are genuinely afraid of it now. And they are afraid of the day that it comes, inevitably, most likely. Stephen said that we don't know if it can happen, and if it does, it will take a long time for people to eventually reach a point where they can accept it or coexist with AI. So moral panics are a very difficult thing to figure out at the moment.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you.
I'll just make a comment. I think I was curious, like, what am I supposed to get out of this presentation? Obviously, like, you presented all this information, was great. So I think I was along the same line of, like, should I be recognizing moral panics, or is this like a reflective process?
I want to point out that a lot of it can be racially biased, and that what goes into the moral panic is usually, like I said, attribution bias, where you place these labels on things and you find a reason for them to be the way they are. Like with Nathan Dunlap, the black man. There are people that don't like black people. And so they are more eager to understand why someone that's black could do this. When you have two white kids, people are less likely to see something like that, or less willing, rather.
I was just also going to make a comment, because with what I really enjoyed about this is what I took from it is this kind of acknowledgement of we need to be self-aware.
Right.
Of being like, if I'm experiencing this panic and I'm fearful, because a lot of the times with these conversations, like with the witch trials, it's fascinating the reasons that they would accuse somebody to be a witch. All sorts of things. Be like a woman couldn't give fair children, witch. Midwife, she was a witch. If she was a healer, witch. You know, it's just, and I think it's this kind of fear that we're seeing something that's different from ourselves.
And that's something I went over with Dr. Brown. It's like we went over in the monsters class. It's the fear of the other,
Right.
and something that's not
yeah,
like
which is such
yourself.
a great conversation.
Right.
So I think that adds to what Stephen was saying too, is that AI can be an excellent tool to really progress
Absolutely.
us forward through technology. But right now, we don't know.
Yes,
Right.
and so once you don't know about something, it's the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't know which way to go.
And I guess we just kind of have to take a chance
Yeah.
a little bit. And again, do something
Roll the
different.
dice.
If I see something that's like, oh, this is a little different, but let's make sure it's not actually the devil or something
Right.
first, you know, like way the devil.
Okay.
But it also seems like that is a double-edged sword, the whole, let's make sure,
Right.
right, let's make sure of these kinds of things. Well, there's a whole lot of bias that can go into the let's make sure kind of question, right? So, I mean, just take the devil thing for a minute. Let's make sure it's really not the devil. We laugh because obviously there's no devil.
Right.
But there's a kind of implicit bias that we're putting into that question as well, right?
Right.
One that favors non-religious empirical views of the world over other views, right? So, I mean, it's not an easy. I mean, I commend you for the topic. It's a great topic, but it's not an easy one to think about where we go from your slides and think about this in the future. It is an easy reflective thing, as Michelle said. It's not so easy to think about where we go from here. It's easy to say, don't be biased, but it's a lot harder to
It's very difficult
think about how we
to keep
apply
the
that.
bias out.
Right. Especially if we don't think that we're biased, right?
And that's the
Since-
thing, a lot of them, then you grow up in a Puritan town being raised that the devil is real, and then you've got people saying it and kind of confirming your belief that the devil is in Salem. You don't really have an option but to be afraid. And that's kind of what happened.
Kind of going off of the fear of the other, both of these instances that you talked about seemed like a lot of the panic was rooted in parents like being fearful for their children. The
That's-
Reverend, it was his two daughters who started the whole panic. And then in Columbine, parents were getting rid of violent video games because they were terrified that it could impact their child to either become a victim of the shooting or the perpetrator of the shooting. And
Yeah, but it's an interesting conversation, because again, like you said, it's like the fear is misplaced.
the
Instead
fear
of
is completely misplaced.
Instead of focusing on the actual problem, we rather put it on some sort of easier thing to contemplate.
So I'm wondering
Yes.
if for a more current moral panic, we don't even have to look as far as AI, but instead the TikTok Supreme Court trials
Right.
that are going on right now. And then placing fear and placing blame in these algorithms and in China and what's going on with TikTok instead of educating kids on how to use the internet responsibly.
Which is something that I think a lot of us may have been better trained in, at least me, growing up. There wasn't a whole lot of supervision over the internet in my household, which is something that definitely could be expanded on and probably should. I think there's not a lot of great things on the internet that probably should be excluded from little kids.
Yeah, so shouldn't there just be more of a conversation there? Let's say like, there is a lot of really horrible things on there.
Yeah.
It's not so much that, oh, we need to like ban these things completely, but there should be some sort of limitation.
Restrictions.
Like, why are we allowing this nastiness to be able to be seen? You know?
I agree.
Wow, what a great conversation, everyone. And thank you, Jeffrey, for.
If you want to just go one more slide.
Oh, one more slide.
Thank you.
Oh.